Hi everyone, happy Monday and welcome to Real Reflective Practice with me, your host, Dr. Anjali Pereira. I hope you're all doing well. Say hi to me if you're here and hit that like button as well. I'm really excited about tonight's show because I have the most incredible guest for you. But before I get into that, last week I read out a reflection from a former NHS consultant who got in touch with me with some thoughts about leadership. And I asked you guys to email me with your own reflections. And the one that I'd like to read out tonight is from an ex-doctor who calls themselves Goodbye FY2. And they got in touch after last week's show on the theme of change. Dear Anjali, like you, I left medicine after FY2, and like you, I didn't really have a plan or a sense of purpose at that time. In your last episode, when you and Katie talked about the theme of change, it made me think about the Black Lives Matter protests going on at the moment and how George Floyd's death sparked so much of a sense of purpose in people that they are now demanding change. It's tragic that despite so many Black lives being lost over the years, it took this level of brutality captured on video for people to feel empowered to rise up. Do you think, therefore, that bad things have to happen to us in order for us to feel able to ask for change? Thank you so much for your reflective practices. They have already been so helpful, and keep up the good work. Sincerely yours, Goodbye FY2. Well, Goodbye FY2, thank you so much for your message and for calling me to speak to this incredibly important movement that we're seeing at the moment. It's really interesting to think about whether we need something bad to happen in order to drive change. There's that old saying that necessity is the mother of invention, right? And the connotations of the word necessity generally, they're bad, or something's lacking, something's wanting. And I know a lot of the rhetoric around the Black Lives Matter movement in the UK is, well, it's not our police force that shot George Floyd. This is an American problem. I mean, why are we so concerned about it here? It's almost like they're saying the problem isn't big enough, it isn't bad enough, to use your word, to justify demanding change. Which obviously as an argument isn't true, because we do have problems of racial injustice in this country. But it's flawed on another level as well. And I was thinking about this today because it's this idea that we can't have innovation or change without a certain level of problems, right? I think there was this brilliant Forbes article a while back that talked about this, and it said innovation is more than just problem solving. So they had level 1, which is sort of the most basic level of innovation, and that's just reactive, basic problem solving. But level 2 is problem prevention. So, foreseeing issues and kind of the prophylactic approach to it, being proactive about change. And then level 3 was this continuous improvement stage. So, there we're saying things like, we've got policies and systems that work well enough. There don't seem to be any obvious problems, but that doesn't mean we can't make it better. And really the greatest changes to our society come from people who are able to see the potential of what could be, right? And not just how to fix things that already exist or look at things that already exist. I mean, think about Apple. Before the first iPhone came out, no one would have even thought smartphones were necessary. So I guess partly that's what makes this Black Lives Matter movement so important. It's that if we're having to deal with level 1 stuff, the basic equality, the fundamental human rights stuff, then we are restricting the space and the creativity really to get to that level 3 stuff. And then that means that as a society, we are missing out on things that we may not even have dreamed of yet. So yeah, thank you so much, Goodbye FY2, for reaching out. And if any of you guys have any reflections that you'd like me to read out on the live stream, then do send them to me at dranjalipereira@gmail.com. Feel free to pick an anonymized name like Goodbye FY2, or I'm very happy to pick one for you if you're more comfortable with that. So yeah, whatever you prefer, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts. So let's crack on with today's theme, which is boundaries. And I just want to say before I start my story tonight that I'm going to be talking about abuse. So if you are triggered by that subject, then maybe just pause and take a moment to decide whether you're okay to listen to this. So I haven't talked about this publicly very much, but I went through an abusive relationship in the past. And I had learnt about abuse and safeguarding, obviously at med school, and then again in training, particularly when I did pediatrics. We covered the connection between abuse and certain mental health disorders, such as narcissistic personality disorder, during my psych placement. But somehow I always saw those things as academic. I never made the connection between what I was learning and what I was experiencing in real life. So later, when I realized that it happened to me, part of my healing and recovery from that was that I went into full-on doctor mode and I began to research abuse. I read books, I read papers, I read and listened to and watched videos of psychologists talking about this, and abuse survivors as well talking about their experiences of this. And I really became obsessed with this area because I needed to understand what happened to me. And one of the concepts that came up time and time again was this idea of boundaries. As I'm sure many of you know, one of the hallmarks of an abusive relationship is that boundaries are constantly broken down, both by the perpetrator and the receiver of the abuse. On one side, the perpetrator oversteps and disrespects the victim's boundaries. They constantly demand that the other person do things, irrespective of, whether the other person actually wants to do them or whether it's even right for them to do them. And then they use emotional manipulations in order to get that person to comply. And on the other side, the abuse receiver has, by this point, become so used to their boundaries being overstepped, and who, in fact, probably never had the actual space or permission and the sense of self, really, to develop healthy boundaries. And they don't even realize that that's what's happening to them. They know it feels uncomfortable, they can't pinpoint why, and they can't really push back. And it hit me like a ton of bricks, actually, when I realized that my history of abuse was one of the reasons that I found it so difficult to cope with the toxicity of the NHS. Because as a doctor, I was constantly being asked to do things. We all are asked to do things that we feel uncomfortable with. But I wasn't able to articulate why that made me uncomfortable. It was a system in the NHS that squeezes you to do things for free and to do things in your own time and even at your own expense, because it's so underfunded. And I ended up doing things that I didn't want to do or need to do for other people just because I found it so hard to say no. And you have to understand, these often weren't abusive individuals. They were usually just colleagues who were trying to get things done or even trying to help me. But the system was set up to be inherently abusive. And for me, as someone who was already bad at defining her boundaries, this systematic abuse was always going to be difficult for me to navigate. And it suddenly all made sense because, if you've spent a significant amount of time in the shadow of an abuser who not only failed to help you to develop appropriate boundaries, but wantonly and repeatedly disrespected your boundaries until that became your normal, it follows that you might then have trouble defining personal and professional boundaries at work. And in a system like the NHS, which is always looking to claw and sap as much from its employees as it possibly can, people who have boundaries, trouble with boundaries, are inevitably going to suffer. So I'm really looking forward to taking apart this theme of boundaries tonight. As always, do feel free to comment in the chat and send me your thoughts. I'm over the moon to be introducing my guest for tonight. She is incredible. If you have ever had a person in your life who is your closest confidant, is the person who knows you better than you know yourself, who you can't lie to about being fine when you're not actually fine because they can see right through you, for me, this is that person. Hannah Kaji is a writer, an artist, and a secondary school educator in modern foreign languages, and she specialises in French and Spanish. She's also a mum to a gorgeous little lad. She is my best friend. We have known each other for 20 years, and she is also really the reason that I'm sitting in front of you today, because it was she who told me that I should take this coaching thing further, and she called it. She's also one of the people who really developed with me this art of real reflective practice. She is amazing, and I'm so lucky to have her on tonight. Hannah, welcome.
Hello. What's a lovely introduction.
Of course.
I don't know how old we are though. This 20 years feels like 5.
Yeah, it's 20 years this September. It's unbelievable, right?
That's crazy.
How are you doing?
I'm okay this evening. How are you?
Yeah. No, I'm really, really excited that you're here. This is amazing. This is brilliant.
I'm excited. It's going to be good. Very good fun.
Hannah, our theme tonight is boundaries. And I'd just like to start by asking you, with the whole lockdown and COVID situation, even though I know you've done a bit of physical teaching in schools, with key workers, kids and vulnerable students, a lot of your work recently has been teaching from home. So you also, like many other parents, have had to deal with having your child at home as well. And so what's it been like for you to have those boundaries between home and work blurring together in that way? And how has that affected you?
It's been quite challenging, I think, because I'd sort of got to a stage just before the lockdown where I was really being strict with my boundaries between work and home. So returning to work after I had my son, I sort of didn't really think about the fact that I now had a little boy, and then I couldn't work in the same way that I previously did, which was to work too much, really, I think, to sort of really throw myself into it. And in that first year back at work, sort of ended up being quite burnt out. So this is the second year back after he's been born. And I decided that I needed to put quite a lot of boundaries in, make sure that I differentiated between home space and put time limits on things, made sure I was really quite boundaried. And then it's like the rug was pulled out from underneath me, and suddenly everything is in one space. You're working and you're trying to look after your child, and you've got your husband in your space, and all of those spaces are kind of blurred together, and all those identities are in one place, and all of your normal outlets are kind of taken away from you. So it took a little bit of time for the ground to settle. It did feel like I was spinning for about a week and a half until I kind of processed where we were at and sorted out a new routine for me and for the baby and for the family. But it's not easy. Even now, it's not easy.
Yeah, I mean, I know that you've given this concept of boundaries a lot of thought. And one of the things you've previously talked about is this idea of impermeable versus porous boundaries, and how different levels of permeability are appropriate for different situations. So yeah, it'd be great if you could tell us a bit more about your thinking around that and what experiences in your life have shaped that, really.
So boundaries. Okay, so I sort of see it as a bit of a spectrum. Okay, so with different people, you might be at different stages on or different places along that spectrum. So obviously, with you, my best friend, we have quite permeable boundaries. We can talk quite openly and freely about lots of different things. With other people, as a sort of protection, you might sort of put quite firm boundaries in. I think an early experience that I had meant that I didn't necessarily learn what appropriate boundaries were. I suffered abuse when I was a small child, and somebody consistently overstepped the mark, and being so little and having no real barometer for what was and wasn't appropriate, I think I sort of internalized that quite a lot, and ended up a little bit confused on that front. And I think that's something that kind of continued throughout my life, in having these kind of quite porous boundaries and not really being able to recognize when somebody was stepping into a place that was too much for me, or if I was giving too much of myself to a situation, or giving too much of myself. So that's been a little bit of a running theme sort of throughout my life, is that I have issues with boundaries maybe because of this situation, maybe because I'm quite an open, creative kind of person. I think that's part of my personality anyway, is to be quite open and flexible, and that's how I connect with people. But as life has gone on, and I've realised that it's realised the downfalls of being too porous with my boundaries, letting too much in, or sort of stepping too far out of my comfort zone. I've had to really sort of think about what is safe for me, what is comfortable, and what is uncomfortable for me. And I think because of this period of time in my childhood where I had this experience, I think for a long time I went without realizing that was something that shouldn't be happening to me, that was a boundary that was being crossed. I think I felt uncomfortable about it, but I was silenced in that feeling of uncomfortableness. So I never really learned how to express when, I'm losing my words here. I never learned how to express it, I think.
Yeah.
And that became quite a problem for me, or to recognize it in myself. I think that's the thing, is you need to learn, or you need to be in a constant state of reflection where you learn what is and isn't comfortable for you. And then when something is uncomfortable for you, you need to be able to be assertive enough to say, no, this is the limit, this is my boundary. And that's a flexible process. So sometimes it will be, that certain periods in your life you're much more flexible, you're much more able to give of yourself, or you're much more able to take on things, and then your situation changes, and then you need to make more sort of rigid boundaries. But it's something that I actively have to really think about, because
it's kind of an effort for you.
My natural stance has been to be quite fluid, quite open, or as a defense to be very rigid. So there's I think the two ends of the spectrum. The people at each end of the spectrum can have things in common with them. So somebody who puts up a very rigid boundary, something that's very, very inflexible. Behind that, you can have somebody who's quite vulnerable. And at the other end, if you've got someone who's never learned how to put that boundary in, and is just a yes man and takes things on and doesn't, people pleaser, that's also a vulnerable person as well. So it's interesting, I think, in your workplace to sort of look at your team, look at the people that you're working with, and think about, where they are on that spectrum.
Yeah, and kind of the facade that they put on. And it's interesting that you talked about that kind of being your natural state, and also having this experience as a small child. Oh, hello, Chandika. Hi, Becky. Nice to see you both. Because I think at that early stage, in those early years, our experiences are so formative, right? I mean, we talk so much about the neuroplasticity of the brain, and the brain obviously is changeable, but once you have certain experience, I think it's you that said something about what's fired and wired together, or something like that. Is there a quote that you...
What's wired together is fired together. So yeah.
And so having that early experience and getting used to having your boundaries overstepped, getting used to this idea that your boundaries aren't important.
Yes.
That kind of, it's interesting to think how that influences even your life as an adult. You can step back and logically you can say that I need to put some boundaries in. But on an emotional level, having that experience in the past, I wonder if there's some dissonance between, your higher cognitive brain and that child within, in some ways.
Definitely. I think that it's, I think when I really sort of exercised all of that, that's sort of only fairly recent for me, is to start thinking about it. It was something that I'd kind of, I knew had been uncomfortable and had happened in my childhood, but I kind of dismissed. I thought, that's something that's happened, it doesn't really affect me anymore. But looking at my life through that prism again, I can sort of see how it has replicated subconsciously. The role that I've moved into has kind of perpetuated throughout my life. And I think, especially in times of high stress, I think you go back to your defaults, or like you say, these things that are quite hardwired when you're very, very young. And part of kind of moving beyond that mode, moving beyond those defaults, is to maybe examine what happened, to really properly process it, to really take it out and to think about how it's still sometimes I think if a trauma happens to a very young child and it's not, they probably don't necessarily have the capacity at the time to process it. I think sometimes certain traumas, you need to reach a certain stage of development, a certain stage of maturity to be able to understand and process what happened to you. And I think maybe having buried it for all that time, I'd got to a point where I was able to face it and to look at it with a bit of distance and to sort of see how it affected me. And since I've done that, I've recognised I kind of know what I need to do, and I know my defaults. So I now need to take the time to make sure that I'm sort of conscious of these glitches in the system.
When it's your defaults, and it's the same with me. I know that I call myself a recovering people pleaser, and when that is your default, when you are used to having porous boundaries, it takes me an enormous amount of effort to push back. And when people ask me something, even if it's the smallest thing, it could be on the phone with someone and they say, oh, would you mind doing this? And my immediate kind of gut reaction is to go, yes, sure, of course I will, and then maybe 2 seconds behind, my brain catches up, and I'm in my 30s now, and I'm still at this place where it takes me a couple of seconds for my brain to say, hang on a second, maybe I actually don't want to do this. And then there's this whole kind of, I start spiraling out and thinking, I've got to backtrack now. I've got to say, I actually don't want to do that. I've got to think of a good reason why. There's an enormous amount of guilt. I feel so bad, and then I start thinking, I start to, overthink, what is the other person going to think of me for A, not complying with what they want, and B, backtracking. And the reality of it is, the likelihood is, and I would do this myself if that happened to me, if I asked somebody for a favor or, a request and they said no, and they wouldn't have to give me an adequate reasoning. I would just say, that's fine. I would be accepting of that. And I would think of myself as unreasonable if I didn't. And yet, because, as you say, it's the default setting, when it's me, when it's the other way around, when I'm the one who's having something asked of me, I find, it's the guilt. It really is the guilt of putting down boundaries that I really struggle with,
I think it's about buying yourself a little bit of time in those situations. That's a sort of new trick that I've kind of developed, is if I'm sort of, I think the more stress I get, the more I tend to agree to things that I shouldn't really. I need to check my schedule, and I get in a bit of a muddle. And I think the best thing to do is to just buy myself some time, and even to say that to someone, to say, I just maybe I just need a little bit of time. No one can fault you for that, and actually to have the confidence to say, no thanks, actually I won't be doing that, and you don't have to explain yourself. My mum has a friend who she talks about quite a lot, who's very good at doing that, and she says she never questions her when she says that. She doesn't push, she's not like, oh, she's never hurt when she says that. It's just something that it's like a sort of, you kind of accept, oh, they've got their reasons for it, that's why they're not doing that kind of thing. And I think it's something that I've really got to think about, being a mother now and having experienced quite severe mental health problems and burnout and things. It's something I've got to really, really think about. I've got to protect myself in order that I can do all the things that I be the person that I want to be for other people, and serve my community, serve my family. And there's no point in me having a really porous boundary, taking everything on and then drowning. I've got to put those limits in for myself and for the people that I care about. So it's something that is important to think about.
One of the things that I remember you said to me when you
just plugging the computer.
That's cool. One of the things that I really remember that you said to me when you were pregnant was that you got really good, actually, and I noticed it. When you were pregnant, you got good at putting yourself first, far better than you had been perhaps in the past, because you were suddenly responsible for you literally had another person within you to put first and to take care of. And then obviously you had the baby, and in those early kind of months, that maternity year, again, you know, you got good at putting baby's needs first, because putting baby's needs first kind of was equal to putting your needs first, you know, and you were able to put yourself first because of the baby. And I certainly found that myself with my daughter is that I find it easier to put myself first when it is through that lens. You know, if I see myself as doing something for her, then I'm able to really speak to my needs. But that's kind of sad in a way. It's like, it's not something that I want her to learn, that, you know, it's only through motherhood that you really think about your boundaries. You know, it's something that I want her to do anyway. And yeah, I think we both find that a little bit difficult to model, you know.
I think it's an interesting kind of, if you think about, I've done quite a lot of work on the inner child. And if you think about it, that you've got, you know, I think everybody has the child self inside, you know, that's that vulnerable self, that raw self that, you know, you don't necessarily show to everybody, that, you know, that you kind of protect in various different ways. And you can be more or less in touch with that vulnerable self, depending on where you are in your sort of, in your life or your relationship with yourself. And I think to actually have that physically, you know, to really be thinking about having another person inside you, another smaller vulnerable self inside you, you know, obviously when you're pregnant, you can see it, you know, there is another person inside you, differentiating that. You've got that sense of protection of your body as the vehicle that is carrying, you know, is carrying life forward, and that, you know, you as a human being have to be protective, yeah, you as a self. And also, I suppose they talk about the fourth trimester, don't they, where you've got, you know, the baby is kind of attached to you, you're breastfeeding, and you are one body when you are breastfeeding them, because, you know, they are so dependent on you in those early months for food, for water, for everything, for nurturing. So becoming a mother was quite an interesting process for me, to really think about that kind of more vulnerable self. But it only, like you said, it only extended as far as then when I went back to work. I suppose I was no longer just sort of thinking about myself anymore. I suddenly went back full time, which I think was a mistake. Full time working, you know, as a teacher is really quite tiring, a big strain. And then having my son as well, and all his demands and needs to meet, and quite a stressful year when I went back to the year I went back to work was quite a stressful year for our department. I just was stretched beyond, and still wanting to give, you know, still with these very porous boundaries, not having put in, you know, or reevaluated my boundaries. I think at that stage I really needed to reevaluate where I was at. I couldn't just, it wasn't like maternity was something that happened and now I'm back to being Hannah and back to being a teacher and Mrs. Cadgy, and that's all fine. I was actually, you know, I actually needed to reevaluate how much of myself I could give, maybe by taking, you know, doing part-time and making time for Rue and for myself, or just not taking as many things on, and just realizing and acknowledging my limitations. But I think being quite a high achieving kind of individual, being quite a kind of ambitious person, I wanted to kind of drive forward. And I think when you're tired, you're so tired when you're a new mum, and then teaching is tiring. I think that's what's really important is about reflective practice, or being a reflective kind of person, is that you need to build in that time in your life to be able to think about these things, to be thinking about, is this too much for me? Is, you know, where am I at with myself? Am I really looking after myself? That's what self-care is. Am I actually going to be able to carry on performing like this? And I think my early experience sort of often made it, I think I numbed that kind of radar in my head that was like, this is too much, because I pushed myself for so long, or experienced that for such a long period of time, kind of quietening my uncomfortableness about it, that now I find it quite hard to recognize when things are too much and I've gone beyond the limit. So tuning into your body, all that mindfulness stuff, I think is really, really important, and actually taking the time to listen to yourself and being, actually, am I okay? Is there something I need to rejig here so that I can function? And having that conversation with yourself, you know, and then taking action. Carrying on, not just pushing forward.
It's very easy to just think about it and then do nothing. I definitely
sometimes you recognize that you're working, you know, that elasticity is kind of stretched to the brink, but you're sort of not, you're somehow, that's the mode that you're in, and you kind of think, if I do something to change, you know, everything's going to crumble down around me. It's why you need to be constantly aware of how far you're pushing yourself. And constantly checking into yourself. And I think in professions like teaching and like medicine, where it's full on day after day, people facing, you know, you are stretched beyond your limits all the time. It's even more important that you do that, to make sure that you can perform at that level, and that the systems that you're working in recognize that and don't ask too much of you, you know, or that there is a recognition that you are working in an environment that is stressful, and that you know, demands a lot of yourself, a lot of your compassion, a lot of your time, energies, and, you know, helps to protect you in some way.
Absolutely. And we've got a couple of comments coming through from Sophia. She says, thank you both so much for sharing these deeply personal experiences with us. I can completely relate to this concept of porous boundaries. It is definitely a skill that I am learning to cultivate. It is definitely very empowering, but quite hard to actually implement, especially when working within the NHS, as Anjali, you may be able to recall. What advice would you give to those who are still working within such settings where your boundaries are constantly challenged and overstepped? That's a really interesting question, because, I mean, certainly I've talked to you about this before, Hannah. For me, I see so many parallels between teaching and medicine in that sense, because, you know, as we were just saying, they're both big, large public services. They're both systems that are used by political footballs, you know, by the government. Yeah, they're both underfunded, they're both under-resourced, and they both effectively rely on the goodwill of doctors and teachers, of their employees, to stay afloat. So, you know, they are both systems, as Sophia said, that will constantly push your boundaries. And the cruelest thing for me, I think, is that when you're a young doctor or a young teacher, those first couple of years at work are really when you're figuring out, you know, your personal and professional boundaries at work, right? You can't learn them before you start working. You have to be in the system in order to develop really those boundaries and that sense of self. So, you know, if you are trained in a system where the norm is that boundaries are pushed, and that is just something you are expected to put up with, you get a really warped idea, right, of what is acceptable. You get used to letting people walk all over your boundaries. And I think, you know, speaking to Sophia's point, perhaps that is why it is so difficult for people like teachers and doctors to develop them. I
think it's really important that you have a leadership that recognises that, but it's a system that goes up and up and up and up, isn't it? I've talked to various people about this. You know, we are the cogs within the system, and we might be trying to implement the change, but if it's not heard above us and above that and above that, it's, you know, you've got the sort of spectre of Ofsted at the top, and that all filters down through the leadership right down to the very, very base layer. And it takes a lot. It takes people with great courage to change, you know, to change the system from within. And you can feel a great sense of angst, I think, if you are starting to put those boundaries in, and, you know, to sort of say, no, this is the limit, this is enough, or to, you know, to say, I don't think that this is fair. I don't think that we should be doing X, Y, Z. I don't think that we should be working this hard. We need to carve this time back for us, or these systems are unjust, these systems are unfair. You know, to put your head above the parapet like that is quite difficult, I think. Yeah. And I think especially in a compassionate profession as well, where you're kind of expected to be given, you're like, well, this is your vocation, this is what you've signed up for, kind of thing. And I think you know, you kind of have to have the real bravery to say, actually, I didn't sign up to be walked all over, you know, I didn't sign up to, you know, lose, you know, my sanity over this kind of thing, or to, you know, to burn out over it. So I think as you get older, you do develop, you know, you like you say, you learn your limits, and you learn where those boundaries are. But I think as you move up the chain, I think it's about thinking about the people who are below you and nurturing them and helping them and creating an ethos within your institution of, no, actually this is the cutoff point and this is acceptable. I think the school or the system that I'm working in now is a lot better at doing that than the previous one that I worked in. I think it does depend on where you work, and it might be like, I don't know if you've had this experience, but in certain hospitals they're better at doing this than in others, or you have certain key individuals who will sort of lead by example on that point. And I think, you know, as a professional, you have to be thinking about, you know, what example am I giving? You know, if I work myself to the bone, or if I let this happen, you know, I think that's where unions are really important, in that you can band together and you can have a louder voice, as it were.
Yeah, no, I think it was difficult for me. I mean, with the medicine being such a hierarchical system, it can be really difficult to put your foot down, really, because you've got these people above you who, you know, are so very clearly senior to you, and they've been in the system longer. They're that kind of hierarchical system is so rigid in medicine that it can be really hard to push back. And it's not necessarily that they're senior doctors. It might just be senior management. It might be the way that the hospitals run. I think you're right in that different hospitals work in different ways. Certainly when the different hospitals that I worked in, they did have different styles and different sort of management styles. So that definitely made a difference. I think I never really had maybe the space or maybe someone saying to me that thinking about these things is actually important. You know, if you are the kind of person who has porous boundaries and that is an issue for you, then taking that step back, thinking about what kind of workplace do I want to work for? What kind of leadership do I need? What kind of management style will suit my personality and will help me to not burn out? No one was really saying those things to me. And as a coach now, I say those things, you know, to my coachees. But I think it's just important to have, the language. I mean, I think when I left medicine, I didn't have the language of boundaries to describe how I felt. So I couldn't explain very well why I felt unhappy in the job.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, I wasn't able to look at senior colleagues who were bullying me and say, you are going over the line and that is not acceptable. I will not tolerate it. You know,
you don't know where the line is necessarily,
exactly.
or you don't know what is and isn't sort of acceptable. I think in one situation that I was in, I could see the mechanisms and I could see my place within them, and I realized no matter how hard I shout, this isn't going to change.
Yeah.
And you know, I can't. I'm not high up enough within this system to actually make any difference, to make this any better. So my only option is to leave. Is to withdraw myself from the situation, is to remove myself completely, which was really sad, because the job that I was in was, you know, there were many things about it that I did enjoy and that I did like, and you know, it was quite heart-wrenching for me to do that, but it was a sort of self-protection thing. I think when you keep fighting and you keep fighting and you keep fighting and you have nothing changes, you end up in a depression. It's, you know, it's a vicious circle, and you just have to withdraw. You have to remove yourself from that situation, and hope that, you know, you're not going to find it again in another job. But then I think it teaches you, doesn't it? You learn that if that you learn to recognize the signs, kind of thing. And I think that it allowed that experience very early on in my career, allowed me in my second post to define my limits and define my boundaries. So one thing that happened in my first job was that I was sort of encouraged to work during my lunchtimes, work over my lunchtimes. And this must be something that happens to doctors all the time, that you don't get a lunch break, that you have to, you know, work on your feet. I remember speaking to one of my housemates, and she said, you know, she didn't even get like a toilet break. You are just working for the people. And I think especially early on in your practice, you need that time. You know, you can make mistakes if you're constantly working and you're so tired and on your feet all the time. You're not even going to the toilet or having something to eat. You know, you're really wearing yourself thin. So this was something I was encouraged to do in my previous post, to work during lunchtimes. And in my second post, I'm quite boundaried on it. I will do a bit if I have the capacity to do it. But it's something that I've learned that actually I need my lunch break. I need to, I need to take that time back to not be with the children all the time, to just take a moment for myself and to speak to, colleagues and stuff. And that's something that I need to put into place. So I suppose you do learn as you go through, and it's having that space to think about, to reflect and to think, this is something that I'm going to carry forward with me. So that's something I've learned that stretched me too much. I can't be doing that. I know that that's bad for me. And if possible, this is how I'm going to do it in the next instant. Although I feel that sometimes it's not even possible, that you can't make that choice and you can't put that boundary in medicine sometimes, that you really are so understaffed and overworked.
Yeah, no, I think it can be extremely difficult. And again, it depends where you are and who you're working for, and whether you have a good team leader. But if you are in that situation where you do feel stuck, and you don't feel like you have the voice, you're not empowered to put in boundaries. I certainly had that in early jobs, especially as a first year doctor, thinking there's nothing I can do. I'm too junior, and the system is too big, and my voice, as you say, isn't loud enough. I can't shout this down. Yeah. And yeah, it was definitely one of the reasons that I eventually left medicine. But I do wonder whether having conversations about it would have made it easier to kind of deal with, having conversation with a mentor or someone to say, look, this is bad. This, you're not crazy. This isn't acceptable. And obviously for you personally, this is a personalized experience. The things that I would find difficult in terms of boundaries, other people don't, and I think we can't sort of tar everyone with the same brush, because we aren't all the same. We do need different things. And I kind of wish someone had taken me aside and say, look, you are allowed to choose a specialty or a profession or whatever. You are allowed to choose that based on who you are and what you need to be healthy, rather than, I was told you should be a GP because you're a woman and then you can have children, or, you should be a surgeon just so you can prove a point to show that, Asian women can be surgeons. And it's like, these are the conversations, it's the kind of conversations I was having around, specializing as a doctor. It really put me off specializing, because you're not really talking about you as a whole person. You're just talking about you as, to use your word from earlier, as a cog in the machine, right?
Yeah, I think you have to really understand yourself and understand your limits to choose a job or to choose a post that works well for you, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. And actually have the courage to be like, actually, this isn't working for me, and I can't make changes that are going to make it even better for me, and then to be able to let it go. But to have a conversation about it, I think that's where you went really with it, wasn't it? When you left, was that you started to have those conversations with people and think about, is this something I can continue with? Is this something that's I can put up with any longer? And if you can't change it, there's no choice, is there really? You have to walk away from things that are and that takes real courage. I was really proud of you when you did that. Enormously proud, because you invest yourself in these things, don't you? Like these compassionate jobs, these compassionate roles, teaching, it can almost, and that's another thing about boundaries, isn't it? I think these jobs, you play a role, you really become it, don't you? When you're a teacher or a doctor, you are in that role, and it becomes part of you and your personality. So there's a death, I think, there's a grief when you kind of walk away from students, from a community, or from a part of yourself that you've really invested time, energy, a lot of your identity in. To walk away from that is difficult. There's a heartbreak, isn't there, really?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's part of your identity. It makes me laugh sometimes, when you said that you have a teacher moment in a kind of like what was it you were saying yesterday about head counting us?
Oh yeah, when we go on a girls' outing and we go on a group, I have to remind myself that I'm not a teacher in all settings. I'm a teacher at work. That work and home boundary and life boundary, that I don't have to be I don't know, solving people's problems. I don't have to be sort of that nurturing role all the time. I can take a step back from that, or I don't have to be head counting you when you're out. I can let somebody else do that. Or the quiz or whatever, that kind of thing. I can take a back seat on that as well. My dad was quite funny. He's a retired teacher, and he said that he was on a skiing holiday, and he saw these little children who were walking very, very close to the edge of of something. Or if children are misbehaving in public, that's another thing that gets me. You just have that automatic kind of instinct. It becomes instinctual that you've got to respond, you've got to react, as you would in your role. Do you ever find that with medicine, where you see somebody ill, someone sick, and you're in that role? You're sort of.
Well, I suppose it's kind of different in medicine, because there's that weird thing about the Hippocratic Oath where you kind of always have to be at the ready, which I think is quite anxiety provoking for doctors. Like, when they ask you, is there a doctor on the plane? And you're like, oh, I'm an F1. I don't know anything. Don't ask me.
Is there another more doctor than me here?
But I think what's worse, what's more common than that, I think, for me, and something that I've actively learned to check, is that when people come to me with problems, and I immediately do the doctor thing of wanting to fix it and jump in with, and I think I've done this with you before and pissed you off in the past before, jump in with like suggestions, like, you got to do this, you got to do that. When actually, normally when people want to speak to you, it's not because they want you to fix it, right? They just want you to hear them. They just want you to listen. They want to feel that someone is empathetic towards them and not judging them. And so it's been, I think, a real progress for me to pull that back and say, I don't need to take responsibility in this situation. This person is talking to me because they just need me to be their friend. They don't need me to be their doctor, And I think, that was a real light bulb moment for me personally.
As if you're a problem solver, you're trained to do that, aren't you? Identify the problem and then fix it. And I think if that's another thing about boundaries, isn't it? It's like we're saying, if you're trained in a certain way and it becomes a default, you have to really be reflective and think about, is this appropriate in this situation? Can I put a boundary in here that means that it's having that flexibility of roles, isn't it? And understanding that those elements of yourself, and when they need to come to the fore and when they need to take a back seat, kind of thing. So
absolutely. I wanted to ask you, actually, when you start putting boundaries in at work, are you getting pushback, and how do you deal with that? Because I remember there was a point in my kind of SHO time where I did sort of try to put boundaries in, but I would get very upset and flustered about it, and I wasn't very good at doing it. So I reached a level where I recognized it was important to set down a boundary, but I would be bad at doing it. That guilt thing would come in, the overthinking again would come in. I'd be hugely anxious. Oh God, what is this going to mean for my future career? This person's going to think I'm an idiot. And when you react like that, it makes it easier for people to continue to overstep your boundaries, because they know they can get to you, not necessarily in a mean way, but if people they think that you're weak or, overly emotional, that you're just unable to cope, when actually the truth is that you just need to do some work on understanding and asserting your boundaries appropriately. And if you were just supported in doing that reflective work, then these situations could be avoided. So I'm wondering, do you get any pushback? Do people continue to ask you, and how do you deal with that?
I think the job, it's maybe not people asking me, it's just that the job is so vast. It's maybe about me assessing those boundaries as well, and knowing where the cutoff point is for myself. Just trying to think about one thing. Maybe about giving the extra sessions to the students and the extra help to the students. Mm-hmm. I think I kind of went very hard line on that and put a very rigid boundary in, and then was quite sort of overly assertive about it, and then had a conversation with my line manager that was actually, Hannah, you are the head of French. You do kind of need to do something a little bit extra to what's the word? Just a little bit extra for your money, kind of thing. And I thought, oh yeah, actually, maybe I could do some more. And it was more about thinking, right, okay, they want this from me. This is something that's a bit of a stretch from me. Where am I going to meet in the middle? Like, where am I going to put the boundary in? So I was still asserting the fact this is something that is, I'm time poor. I've got, demands on me at home and a certain amount of energy. But yes, I can see how some targeted sessions with the students would be useful, and it would help them, and it would fulfill my role. So where am I going to meet in the middle? Where is going to be my limit, kind of thing? And then you're having a discussion, aren't you? You're not being completely inflexible. You're not putting a complete hard, rigid wall down and saying, no way, I'm not going to do this, because that's not really being a team player. But you're not being a doormat. You're not saying, yes, I'll do everything. You're meeting in the middle, but you are being assertive with it. I think the learning in that was that I'd recognised that was a push for me, and that was a stretch for me, and I'd recognised that I needed to say something, but I'd gone too hardline. So it was a real learning for me to think about, okay, right, how am I going to discuss that and assert that, and actually articulating that to my line manager, who's lovely. She understood, and she said, yes, I can understand. Obviously you've got your family and your demands here, but this is your role. You do need to be doing a certain amount of extra things. Let's talk together about how we can do this. And if you've got a supportive management system, then they are going to ask of you things, but it's a negotiation. It's about what is, if you can say, actually, this is beyond my capacity, this is too much, or at a certain time you might say, well, I want to do this, but actually I don't have the capacity to do this at this time. And if your management is saying, well, you kind of have to, you then have to draw your own, you have to make decisions, don't you? It's like a stay or go kind of thing. But I think it's about having the confidence in your own voice and your own reflective practice to know that you can say yes or no to things. And yes, it might change your career path, but doing things at the expense of yourself all the time has an impact on how well you're going to succeed anyway in the long term. It might be a slower path, a slower trajectory as you ease yourself into it, but it means you don't burn out too soon. Do you feel that there's a pressure to keep working and push and push and push and push?
Oh, absolutely. But yeah, it's something I talked about a couple of weeks ago with a coach friend of mine about your non-negotiables, just knowing what your non-negotiables are.
Yeah.
And yes, I love what you say about having that conversation and negotiation and reaching that sense of balance, that middle point. And if you can do that, then brilliant. But just knowing what the final line is, just knowing what that was, and when that gets hit, that for yourself, you need to pull back. And that's something that I don't think in medicine I ever really considered. And I think I do know these things now. So yeah, I think it is about giving yourself that time to really get to know yourself, and to really say it's okay. Like, it's okay for me to have this boundary. I think that is one of the biggest things for me, was to give myself permission to have them, Yeah.
And to know that those boundaries might change at different times in your life. I think particularly for women, when you have a boundary, when you have a baby, things really change, don't they? The capacity that you once had, the energies that you once had, the free time and flexibility is completely overturned, and that takes time. That takes time to kind of work through. I think having mentors in your workplace is really, really good. People that you can look up to and you can talk in safety with. Yeah, so you can articulate these kind of fears, and these are, well, I kind of want to draw back on this, but I'm worried, how it's gonna look professionally, that kind of thing. Having people like yourself outside who have an understanding of the situation, but who are slightly removed from it, to coach you and to mentor you, I think is really, really, really important. Actually, I think it would help people be more effective at work, more balanced and healthy, and that kind of thing. And I wish it was built into the system. I wish it was kind of built into the system, that kind of stuff.
So do I. I really wish it was built into the NHS more. But yeah, that's just the way it is at the moment, isn't it? We have run massively over time. Probably. Oh God. You and I just can't stop nattering. But hey, that's no surprise, is it? Well, thank you so much, Hannah, for coming on tonight. This has been such an amazing conversation. I really appreciate it. And if people would like to get in touch with you, then where can they find you?
Via email. I think, have you posted it? You can always email me, talk to me about, if you're a teacher who happens to be listening to this and you want to talk about boundaries, then that's lovely. I'll be happy to speak with you.
Cool. So yeah, I will put Hannah's email in the show notes later on today. And so yeah, get in touch with her. I will speak to you soon, Hannah. Take care.
Bye.
Bye. Wasn't she amazing? Thank you again for coming tonight, guys. I hope you enjoyed this practice. Sorry I overran a bit, but yeah, you know what it's like with your best mates. You kind of natter on. Please like and subscribe and share this with your friends and colleagues. The bigger this platform gets, the more I can keep doing this. So thank you so much for your support. Again, if you'd like to send me your reflections on tonight's show or any other show for that matter, please email me your thoughts at drangelipereira@gmail.com. And I will read them out on future shows. You can also reach me on Twitter or Facebook at Disillusioned. I am back next Monday talking to Dr. Michael Sammy about the theme of creativity. So that should be an interesting one. So join me then. Until then, take care, guys. Stay inspired, and I will speak to you very soon. Bye.